Okay.
You should be, yeah, you should be a host now, and that should allow you to share the screen, see whether that works.
Yep, it works. Let me, there.
Yep.
Does that work?
Yep, that works great. The only thing that will happen is Diana will ask just to switch to her one more time before we actually start, so she can actually start the recording then, so that
Martin, I went ahead and just
started
recording.
Yeah, and I think you can
Doesn't have to mess
record.
with it.
Exactly, you don't have to share the screen to start recording.
Perfect. Great. That's great.
So
then,
I wanted to ask you, how long would you prefer the talk to be, and do you prefer questions throughout or only at the end?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it probably is better to have the questions at the end, because it's always, I will monitor the chat box to see whether there will be questions that are coming in, but it probably be best to do it at the end. I'll try to moderate that a little bit. It'll be, have you presented for Quentin before, where at the Transcontinental? Yeah, so we'll probably do it very similarly. I'll give a short introduction. And then remind people that they can type in questions in the chat box, and that we'll be having some time for discussion afterwards. Usually we run about 45 minutes for the talk itself, and then maybe 15 minutes for Q&A to see try to get some discussion going. It's still it can be a little variable because people. I mean, the people at the Institute have no problem, but in the wider audience, I may need to kind of get them to do a little bit more participation.
Okay.
But,
yeah, from my point of view, if people have especially like small clarification questions, they can ask them throughout. That's okay with me.
Yeah, if I see something that pops up, I may just bring it up. It's usually difficult if you have a bunch of people to try to unmute themselves. I'll remind people to stay muted so that we won't have too much kind of background noise, and then should be pretty straightforward. Just a question: where did you take that picture? Where's the?
This is it's called Bridge Over the Hudson. It's an old railroad, railway that went over the Hudson and was remade into a pedestrian bridge. So you can walk all the way across the Hudson and back, unless you have someone waiting for you on the other side. It's really cool.
Yeah,
it's in kind of upstate New York. I mean, upstate from Manhattan, and
yeah.
Yeah.
I spent actually, I did my internship at LIJ and spent 1 year in New York, in Mamaroneck. We were living up in Mamaroneck, and so so I know the area a little bit, but it's been a long time. So
this is right next. It's from Poughkeepsie. It starts from Poughkeepsie. Okay. Yeah.
So it's a little further north. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. I have a question for you, unrelated to my talk. We are trying to figure out a questionnaire battery that would be kind of transdiagnostic to give to subjects that we're doing our tasks, that are doing some tasks where it's totally exploratory, so we don't know kind of what will correlate with what. And we have been asking some people who are experts on different disorders to just kind of take a look at what we chose. We chose a PID and another thing, like 2 big questionnaires, and to say whether we're kind of losing too much on the specificity of specific constructs because the other alternative is to take a bunch of questionnaires that are specific to different disorders. And my question was, would you be willing to give us your opinion on the domain of social anxiety? Like if we're losing too much in social anxiety questions by using this very general questionnaire, or it's okay.
Yeah, I can certainly look at it. When I was working with Murray, he was usually using the SIAS, as sort of the standard questionnaire. But yeah, I can definitely take a look at it and see what you've got covered. Most of it's probably covered because there's if you do, for example, you do personalities, you have a lot of avoidance items, social avoidance items, you'll cover social anxiety pretty well.
Great, great. So Sam Zorowitz from my lab is heading this effort, so he'll send you an email.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds great.
Direct ask. Thank you so much.
So is this for basically a clinical population, or is it for a student population, or
It's
what kind of target?
Online population, everybody and anybody.
So it'd be like
a few robots as well, although we try to avoid them.
So it'd be like an MTurk study.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, then the only issue, of course, is always this participation burden, right? I mean, how many questions can you ask somebody before they kind of get before they give you just okay, I'm only going to choose the left side or the right side or whatever it is that.
Yeah, we've been struggling with that. We do multiple session experiments, so we don't have the task and the questionnaire on the same day because that becomes too long.
Too much.
And also we tell that we pay quite nicely, so we try to tell them, please free up the next hour, and if you can't, just don't do this experiment now. But we're paying you for an hour, so you need to spend that time on it.
Yeah. So usually what happens is that people are trickling in a little around noon our time here, so I'll give you about a minute or so. Are you? Is the university? So what's the current status of the university? Are you guys closed, or do distance learning, or what are you doing?
Distance learning. Yeah. I should also say, by the way, to people who are already here, I do see your videos, like some of you, not a lot, but if people are comfortable turning their camera on, then seeing a few friendly faces is always nice. Now I see you, Martin, so that's already one friendly face. But always nice to see a few people. You get like some feedback. Is what I'm saying registering, or is it like completely?
I'm glad that you're bringing this up, because we had a retreat the other day where we kind of discussed things to do, and one of the things that it's like people have gotten into the habit to turn off their camera. But I agree with you. It's actually nice to have somebody actually, have some facial feedback, so that you don't think like you're talking into the void, which can be somewhat. It can be a little dissociating. So if people feel comfortable, I would encourage people to turn on their cameras, keep their microphones muted for now, but to maybe turn on their cameras.
Yeah, there is this method, I don't know if you guys have discovered it yet, in Zoom to present a part of your screen. So that's what I'm doing now. So I can see your camera is not overlapping on my slides. It's really useful.
Oh, I see. No, I haven't. So
when you do share screen in Zoom, there are actually tabs on the top. One of them is called Advanced. And if you go to Advanced, you can share part of your screen, and it's just a square, and you can shape it to the exact size. So I'm presenting the slides in rehearse mode, so I see my notes and everything, and I'm showing you only the part of the screen that is the slide. But that gives me a lot of real estate all around it to put the chat, to put the videos, to see my notes. That's also because I have a large screen, but it's since someone told me about that, that's what I do all the time.
That's actually a really good idea, because I usually just have like one screen, just the slide screen, and the other one, the presenter view. But that takes up all the real estate, so you don't really have any extra space.
Also, then I don't know where to look at, because if I'm looking at the people, they see me from the side. Like if I have two screens but the camera only on one, it's difficult. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do is I see that folks have drifted in a little bit, so let me give you a short introduction, and then we'll get right to it. So for everybody who is online, and for those who are coming online, I'm extremely excited to have Yael Niv present to us today from Princeton. So just a little bit of background about Yael. She did her PhD actually at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with their supervisor, Peter Dian, who is probably one of the greats in the field of computational psychiatry, focusing on the link between motivation and habitual instrumental behavior. And I've been thinking about what to say about you, Yael, and there's three things I want to say. So the first thing I want to say, you give one of the most clearest talks about computational psychiatry that I've actually seen from anybody. So I'm always very excited to have you present. The second thing I want to say is that I really appreciate your fierce intellectual spirit, because in as much as you've worked on relating value to mood, your recent piece on questioning whether there's even value representation in the brain is quite striking. And then of course your viewpoint on the primacy of behavioral research speaks quite strongly to what I believe is very important, that we shouldn't forget about behavior and only chase neuroscience. And the third thing that I want to say, and that's sort of in the broader spirit, I think you've been a very good representative and an advocate for diversity in science. And I think that that's something that is really important. I think we're, particularly in the computational psychiatry field, it's still very much, first of all, a male-dominant field, and I think we need to be aware that we need really a much greater diversity within the field. So, so you've been really, from my perspective, from what I'm seeing from the outside, really at the forefront of that. But again, I'm very excited about what you're going to be talking about, and you guys can see the title here, because I do think what you'll find for everybody who's listening in on is what we're struggling with at this point in time in the computational psychiatry field is to find clear constructs that we can identify and determine the role of for psychiatric diseases. And I think that the work that you're doing is clearly motivated in identifying some of these constructs and its relevance. So again, I'm very excited to have you here, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for this really amazing introduction, and for having me here virtually give this talk. This talk is not about computational psychiatry, but I can make a few links on the way. So they say that you can't step into the same river twice. And obviously saying that from the vantage point of this semester, that's probably a good thing. But the interesting thing is that means that everything that we experience in a novel way, but still we learn. And learning is all about taking our past experience and applying it to our present situation. So this makes me think that basically all of learning is generalization. A lot of people study learning, and generalization is a question in learning, but I think really learning is generalization. And really the main question to ask, or one of the main questions that we're asking in my lab, is when we learn, how do we set the boundaries between what we will generalize across? So we call this situation similar enough to what past situations, so that I can learn from those situations to about what to do right now, versus what is different. So, I'm giving a talk right now. I can learn from a lot of previous talks, even though none of them were at LIBR. I can even learn from talks that were not on Zoom, but probably there are some things that I should not generalize from those. So in reinforcement learning terms, we're really asking kind of how do I describe the task as a series of states that I can learn values for, I can learn policies for, and as Martin said, I'm a big fan of thinking about learning policies directly without learning values. And this is not straightforward, even when we think about really simple animal conditioning experiments. So a classic experiment is fear conditioning. You pair a tone that is a neutral stimulus with a foot shock that is an aversive stimulus to the animal, to the rodent. And I was going to say over time, they learn to fear the tone, but in fact, not even over time. Once is enough. 3 times is plenty. three of these pairings, and the animals reliably are fearful of the tone and show that through their freezing behavior. And this is a very widely used paradigm to study is a model of phobias or post-traumatic stress disorder, or in general, very strong memories that are difficult to change later on. And one of the ways that people have gone about trying to change this fear memory or this association between the tone and the shock is to follow it up with what's called extinction. So in extinction, the animal is exposed only to the shock with, only to the tone with no shocks over and over again until the animal is no longer freezing or no longer freezing as much. They do continue freezing to some extent. And I'm saying that it's not straightforward how exactly they generalize because extinction, it works but is quite fragile. So if there was full generalization between what was learned about the tone in acquisition and what was learned about the tone in extinction, you would think that at this point in time, the animal realizes this tone is not associated with a shock. We don't need to fear it. But it turns out that if you wait a month and test the animal again, so just play the tone again, the animal goes back to freezing. So, and you can do other things. You can just, if you don't want to wait a month, you can test the animal in a different environment, play the same tone, but in a different box, the animal will freeze. Or you could do, you could give the animal a reminder shock, no tone, just a shock, and then test the animal. And here's an example of one of many, many experiments. So all of these different manipulations show, so here with no reminder shock, the animal freezes a little bit more at test than it did at the end of extinction, but with a reminder shock, it freezes a lot more. So all of these experiments show that extinction doesn't actually cause unlearning of the old association. So it's not that the tone was associated with shock and then it was no longer associated with shock, but rather people consider it to be creating new learning, an alternative association. So there's an association between the tone and the shock, and another between a different association between tone and no shock. And when I say a different association, that implies no generalization across this boundary. So all of the experience here was considered different enough from the experience here and was not generalized and was learned separately. And these two associations compete with each other. So actually many years ago when I just started my lab, Sam Gershman and I were thinking about this question a lot and about how do we model and formalize the way, the conditions under which animals start a new association, draw a generalization boundary between one set of event and another set of events. And the idea was that we can think more broadly than kind of associations between observable events. So usually people think of an association between a tone and a shock. But if we think about this as a causal association, the tone doesn't actually cause the shock. That's not the true description of the world. The true description of the world is there's a hidden construct, there's a latent variable, the code that we wrote into the, the apparatus that runs the box, or we could just say the experimenter, is a latent variable that caused both the tone and the shock. And this is a more correct depiction of the environment. So maybe we can think of animals as learning the true causal structure and allowing for some of the components of this causal structure to be hidden, to be latent. And we can think about that in our daily life. We are constantly inferring causes for events that we encounter, and those causes don't have to be observable. We infer that something fell because of gravity, even if I never measured gravity and definitely did not see it, that is totally part of my model of the world. So it makes sense that animals also might have this kind of more rich model of the environment. But of course, once we put in hidden variables, there could be many hidden variables, not just one, there could be 2, there could be 15. So that again starts breaking our ability to generalize, because for instance, if the animal inferred that every trial in the task came from a different latent cause, then anything that I learned about the previous trial says nothing about the next trial because it's a different latent cause. Who knows what it's going to do? So what we wanted to do is model the animal's learning process or the animal's inference about latent causes in the environment using a model that is flexible enough to allow latent causes, but also parsimonious enough or constrained enough to allow learning, to make the animal want to kind of group things together as much as possible. And so we used Bayesian inference with a prior called a Chinese restaurant process prior, or an infinite capacity mixture model. And the idea here is this: we are assuming, so saying that we're using this prior is saying we are assuming that the animal, be it a rodent or a human, any animal, has some assumptions about how the world works. And it takes those assumptions and interprets the environmental events given those assumptions. And so here are the assumptions that we are assuming that the animal has. So we're assuming that the animal is going to assign each trial, so each set of events that come together in time, to one latent cause, not too many latent causes. That's just because this is enough for all the experiments that I will show you. There are other models. You can easily relax this assumption, but it already makes the model a lot simpler. So there's one latent cause per trial. And all else equal, a latent cause that has caused many trials is more likely to cause the next trial. So the idea here is the animal is basically assuming that whatever it's seen a lot of, it's more likely to see on the next trial. So this is the assumption that makes the model parsimonious and makes the animal assume fewer latent causes rather than many. In mathese, the idea is that the probability of the cause on trial T being cause number K is proportional to NK, the number of observations, the number of trials that already came from cause K. But the number of possible latent causes is unbounded, and that's what you see down here. So there's always some probability, proportional to alpha here. Alpha is a constant, it's a parameter, for the cause of the current observation to be a new cause. And I wrote here cluster and not cause, and that will be clearer in a minute, because they're basically the same. Because if you think of a latent cause as tying together a bunch of trials, it's like a cluster of trials. All these trials are clustered together, and what I learned from one of them, I apply to another. So that is a prior. So longer name than the equation even. And so this is the belief that the animal comes with for each before it sees an event. And then when the events of that trial unfolds, let's say there's a tone, let's say there's a shock, the animal can take the likelihood of those events combined with the prior probability and decide, so which latent cause actually caused this. And the likelihood here in our model, it basically boils down to assuming that each latent cause tends to produce similar trials. So if I have a latent cause that all the trials it's produced so far had tones and shocks, and suddenly I get a trial with a tone and no shock, it's less likely to come from that old latent cause, more likely to come from a new latent cause. So I have both the prior probability before the observations and the likelihood after the observations. And it's called a Chinese restaurant process prior. I did not invent that name. It was I think the story is people at Stanford, computer scientists who used to go to Chinese restaurants for lunch, invented this name. And they had in mind, there's also the Indian buffet process prior. They had in mind this analogy where you can think of a huge restaurant with an infinite number of tables. Each table is a latent cause. And customers come in, each trial is a customer coming in and choosing a table, and they tend to choose tables where a lot of people are already sitting, but once in a while they start a new table. And then the likelihood, you can think of that as each table is eating one characteristic dish. So that's just kind of like a way to remember how this model works. So if we go back to our extinction task, the idea is that the true causal structure was we had, a computer program that ran the task for the first 3 trials of tone and shock. And then usually extinction usually happens on a separate day. So on the next day, we turn on a different computer program that now causes tones to appear, but no shocks, and that's extinction. This is the true generative model, generative process, sorry, of the environment. But the animal doesn't get to see the latent causes, it just gets to see the observed events and tries to infer what is the most likely configuration of latent causes. And the idea is that given the probability, the prior probability, which I just showed you is the Chinese restaurant process, and the likelihood, given that this cause is active, how likely am I to see both a tone and a shock? Given that this cause is active, how likely am I to see both a tone and a shock? Combining these two is basically what Bayesian inference is, just multiplying these probabilities. And so the animal is basically, maybe doing this directly in its head, maybe doing some approximation, but in some way enumerating over or approximating the enumeration over all the possibilities. So starting from there was one latent cause that caused everything and ending with there was a separate latent cause for each and every trial and any combination in between, and calculating their probabilities, and maybe the most likely combination, ideally the most likely combination is the true combination. So that's inference. And now we can think of the experiments asking, are animals afraid of the tone or not on a test day slightly differently, because previously the question was, why does fear come back? But now I can think about this idea of like when I gave the rat a reminder shock, that is much more likely to be associated with the first latent cause, also with a new latent cause. So this is probabilistic. So it could be maybe like 50% that old latent cause and 50% a new latent cause, or 70% this and 30% the new one, depending on the exact value of alpha and other parameters of the model. But especially if we have a model where, which is a little bit different from the model that I just showed you, where latent causes that are active are more likely to stay active on the next time step, which is really easy to do. It's to add that to the equation in the previous slide. If you add that, now it's clear why the animal would freeze more on the next trial, because it's much more likely that the next trial is going to cause a tone and a shock versus just a tone. I didn't say in the beginning, but if you have any clarification questions, just you can write them in the chat, and Martin will let me know if something needs answering immediately. So to summarize, this was the theoretical part of the talk. Everything else is going to be experiments. So what I'm saying is we're reconceptualizing or rethinking about learning, not as only associating or learning weights or values of different stimuli in terms of predicting outcomes, but if we think about learning in the real world, not even, the real world is not divided into trials. Bits of experience are impinging on us all the time. And the first thing we have to do is cluster them together. And this is why latent causes and clusters are the same idea in my mind. We cluster them together and say, all of these are of one kind. So I'm going to learn from one of them about the other. And all of these are of a different kind. So I'm going to learn about them separately. So we cluster these experiences together into memory traces or latent causes or states in reinforcement learning based on similarity. And the idea is that learning through your favorite learning algorithm, Rescorla-Wagner, temporal difference learning, just counting, any algorithm that you want, would happen within a cluster and not across cluster boundaries. So the idea is that if all of learning is generalization, latent cause inference, which is inferring the current state of the task in reinforcement learning terms, sets the boundaries of generalization. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is show you results from a bunch of experiments, where first I'll look at the basic premise here that similarity helps us determine state boundaries or cluster boundaries or generalization boundaries. Then I'm going to talk about what is the role for prediction errors in splitting these clusters, and specifically in splitting memories. And that will lead to the second part of the talk, which is more about diving into memory directly and thinking about the effect of prediction errors on the strength of episodic memories, and finally putting it all together and asking whether prediction errors strengthen memories or separate clusters or both. So the first experiment. So we wanted to test whether similarity determines the boundaries of generalization. And we had only 2 weeks because this was like a quick turnaround of a grant that never got funded. So we did this experiment that ended up being one of my all-time favorites from my lab, even though it's super simple. We gave human subjects displays like this and asked them to guess as fast as possible, no longer than 5 seconds time, how many circles they see. So please make a guess. You can say it out loud. I mean, most of you are muted, but you make your guess. I hope you did. There were 39 circles. Maybe some of you were closer than others. Let's do it again. How many circles? Okay, that was 5 seconds. So this was 61 circles. Okay, so that's what the experiment was like. And subjects just did this many trials, and they were told that sometimes when they were very close, we said, that was close. And they were just told to try to be as close as possible. I can't even remember. I don't think we paid them according to their performance. And we were not really interested in their ability to estimate numbers of circles really quickly. What we were more interested in, or the only thing we were interested in, is their ability to learn from the true number of circles what the next guess should be. Because as you can imagine, the number of circles came from a Gaussian with some mean and some variance. And so if they average over these true number of circles, they can get an estimate of the mean and guess that. But there was one catch here. So there were 2 types of trials. Trials came in 2 flavors. So as you saw, some trials had all yellow circles and some had all red circles. I didn't mention anything about color previously. We also didn't mention anything about color to the subjects. But the 2 colors did come from different distributions. So in the case that I showed you, these were trials from what we call condition 1, where the yellow trials came from mean 65 and the red trials came from mean 35. So there was a whole block of these, maybe 30 trials from this block, and then a new block would start, and that block had 2 other colors, but for simplicity, I'm going to draw them as yellow and red here too. It was all randomized across subjects. And in blocks from condition 2, the yellow circles still came from mean 65, so they're exactly identical to condition 1, but the red circles came from mean 55. And subjects completed several blocks of this experiment, half of them from condition 1, half of them from condition 2, randomly interleaved. So it wasn't, wasn't condition 1, then condition 2, it was just a bunch and a bunch in any random order. And at no point did we mention color. The idea, or the thing that we were hoping to see, was our hypothesis was that because in condition 2, the red circles and the yellow circles come from very similar distributions, subjects might lump them all together into one latent cause, one cluster, learn the overall mean, which in this case is 60, and guess close to 60, regardless of the color of the trials. Whereas in condition 1, we thought they would separate the 2 colors and learn, so separate them into 2 clusters of 2 latent causes and learn separately the mean of the yellow circles and the mean of the red circles. So if we now test, if we compare only their guesses on yellow circles in both conditions, the yellow circles are identical. In condition 1, we expect them to be closer to the true mean of 65 because basically there's no interference of the red circles. And in condition 2, we expect them to be closer to 60 because they are all lumped together. And that's exactly what we saw. So condition 2 closer to 60, condition 1 closer to 65. And this was replicated several times and in different ways of manipulating similarity between the distributions. You can change the variance rather than the mean. We can have the fixed condition be the lower mean rather than the higher mean. In all cases, we get the same result. And I love this experiment because I think it really shows us that this is likely not an explicit process that people are aware of, but that they are basically treating these two conditions differently. In one case, ignoring color, and in the other case, taking color into account and dividing their experiences based on whether they think everything that they see is caused by one distribution, one latent cause, or two distributions. So that's from the point of view of learning. What about the point of view of memory? So I said here, we cluster experiences together into memory traces. Why am I saying that these are memory traces? So our hypothesis was that the way things that we infer are similar, we would also store them together in our memory system. And so to test that, we gave subjects, again, humans, a different task. In this task, the previous one was a circles experiment. This is the lines experiment. So they're asked to predict the next line. So they take their cursor and draw a line, and then they see the true line. So the closer they are, the more points that they get. And the true kind of generative structure of this experiment is these lines. The true line changes from trial to trial by, it changes its length a little bit and its angle, its orientation a little bit. So now the subject has to guess the next, to predict the next line, and they're pretty close this time, get 80 points, and so on. And down here, you can see that this ball kind of enumerates trial. So this is trial number 6. The block started here, and we can go all the way to the end of the block. Please predict the next line, and they predict it. And now at the very end of the block, we asked subjects to reconstruct from memory the line that they saw in one of the first few trials. And here too, like in the circles experiment, there were 2 types of blocks. So subjects completed a whole bunch of blocks, randomly interleaved 2 kinds of blocks. One block we call the gradual block. And in this block, you can see here, each circle is a trial, and you can see the length and the orientation of the line, the true line on that trial. And as you see, they change very slowly in a random walk. In the jump condition, it was the exact same, except in the very middle of the block, there was one change that was 4 times as big as our normal changes from trial to trial. And so the line would become suddenly, like in this case, a lot longer, and the angle would go from, you know, about 60 degrees to about 80 degrees or 75. And our hypothesis, as previously, was, but now about memory and less about learning, was that in the gradual case, all of these lines would be grouped together into one big memory trace, and so they would all interfere with each other. Whereas in the jump condition, we would have 2 memory traces, because this larger jump would kind of separate the stimuli. And so when we're asking the subjects to reconstruct from memory one of these first lines, they should be more accurate in the jump condition, which had less interference, and less accurate in the gradual condition. And I should say 2 things. One is, in the task we asked them to predict the next line, we were not really interested in their predictions. That was just to get them to pay attention to the lines. So really, we would like them to just look at the lines and memorize them, but that's not a very interesting experiment. And the second thing to say is that we carefully controlled for the distance between the first line in the block and the last line. So they are the same distances, Euclidean distances here and here, so that that would not be driving our results. So we ask subjects to, let's say, reconstruct this first line. So they draw some line, it has some length and some orientation. And now we can just measure the actual Euclidean distance between what they reconstructed and the true line. And the smaller this distance, the better their reconstruction. And we can also measure the distance from the very last line that they saw to see kind of how much interference there is. So the smaller this distance, the worse their memory. And here are the results of the experiment. So you can see that in the jump condition, this condition where we hypothesized that memory would be more accurate, indeed what they're drawing is closer to the start and farther from the end, which is exactly what we want for a more accurate memory. So it seems like what we're seeing here is something that I like to call or didn't used to think about it this way, but now I think about it as a battle between learning and memory. So as experience is impinging on us and we're categorizing it or clustering it into these clusters, these latent causes, when something new comes about, so a trial that is different from what we've seen before, that's where we have to decide, am I going to learn or am I going to memorize, right? So people in the learning literature, reinforcement learning, would say, well, you know, previously the probability of shock was 100%, now it's 75%. You learn, you change your previous memory, and the memory was, you know, 100% shock fidelity to all of the previous memories. And now the new memory is 75% shock, which is different from any one of the experiences, but it's an average of all of them. So that's learning. Oh, sorry, why did that happen again? That's reinforcement learning. On the other hand, all my animations here completely messed up. That was supposed to move into there. This has never happened before, but you will bear with me here. Alternatively, you can take that new observation and put it in a new latent cause, a new state, and you could call that memorizing. And you've also conserved the fidelity of the old memory and made a new memory. So that's the battle between learning and memory. And of course, I should say that in our model, this is probabilistic. So an animal or a human can do both, can partly put that new observation in the old latent cause and learn from it, and partly put it in the new latent cause. And the bigger the part that goes into the old latent cause, the more it will influence what I believe about, let's say, the probability of shocks. So the question from this is, how can we use this, if this understanding is true, how can we use it to erase a fear memory, going back to, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder or phobias or memories that are maladaptive and that we want to change? And we know that extinction works, but only temporarily, and it does not generalize well. But it seems from this model that the problem is that in extinction, we take those new trials and put them in a new latent cause. So what if we make extinction more similar to acquisition, so we can kind of coax the animal to put those new trials in the old latent cause and start filling this old latent cause with trials without shocks? And so that's what we did in an experiment in rodents. So this was in the lab of Marie Monfils, and we had 3 groups of rats in this experiment. Group number 1 is an important group, and that we call it a gradual extinction group. So we gave animals 3 trials of acquisition, and then the next day in extinction, instead of regular extinction, which is what you see here in group number 2, tones and no shocks, every one of these rectangles stands for a tone. Instead, we gave them, the first trial was a tone and a shock, and then the next trial, tone and no shock, and then tone and shock and 2 tones and no shock, and tone and shock and 3 tones and no shock, etc. So we're basically weaning them off the shock slowly. And our hope was that at any point in time, the recent observations would be similar enough to the old latent cause, so the animal would put them in that old latent cause. And as things are kind of getting better and there are fewer and fewer shocks, there are also fewer and fewer shocks in that latent cause. So it's not so unusual to see trials without shocks, and they can all go into that old latent cause and slowly dilute the probability of shocks there. And so if we test for reinstatement, so giving a reminder shock and testing whether they're afraid of the tone, or if we test for spontaneous recovery 30 days later, there should in a way be nothing to recover, because we really took that old memory, that old latent cause, and added all of these non-reinforced trials into it. So we compared this group to a different group of rats that got regular extinction, and to a third group of rats that got the same number of shocks in extinction, but here things were getting worse rather than getting better. And our hope was, well, this was a control because we needed to have 5 shocks in extinction as a proper.
Yeah, I do.
Sorry.
Can you put that on? No. It's a Zoom meeting.
Someone is unmuted.
There's somebody who's unmuted.
It says they're recording.
Can we mute?
I think, let's see if I can mute all.
Yeah, I think you can mute all.
Here.
Participants. There we go. Look at the participants. I can see who it is.
Yeah, I can see it's Greg Coleman.
I asked to mute, but it doesn't. Oh, it does let me mute them. Yeah, sorry, but I asked the wrong person, I think. Could it be Katie Thompson?
No, it's Greg Coleman.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can mute him. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So where were we? Okay. So in the gradual reverse condition, we were hoping, I didn't mute myself, right?
No.
Okay. We were hoping that suddenly there's this quiet, that in the beginning, things would be different enough that a new latent cause would start. And then either that new latent cause would absorb all of the unreinforced trials or would absorb all the trials from then on. But in any case, this old latent cause would be, saved in all its mighty prediction of shocks. And so we did these two tests, and here are the results. So what you see here, so the test is basically a day later or 30 days later, we play the tone 4 times, and we are comparing the freezing in those 4 trials to the last 4 trials in Extinction for each of the rats. And I should also say that across these different groups, freezing in the last 4 trials was not significantly different between the groups. That's why we always had 9 non-reinforced trials at the end. And what you see here is in a reinstatement test, so this is giving a reminder shock, with standard extinction, rats freeze 40% more at test than they did at the end of extinction, whereas with gradual extinction, it's not significantly different from 0. So they didn't significantly increase their freezing. And the same for spontaneous recovery. Here the increase is smaller, but again, significant. So 10%, they're freezing 10% more after waiting a month. So rather than forgetting their fear rebounded. But in the gradual extinction group, they're not freezing more. If anything, they're freezing less, but this is, again, not significantly different from 0. And the reverse gradual condition looks just like the standard condition. So if we think about the role of prediction errors here, like what happens when you give a non-reinforced or a reinforced trial that is not expected? And so if you think about learning or updating of the original learning, updating of an old memory, if we have no prediction error, if everything is predicted, of course, there won't be any updating. And as a prediction error grows and grows, there's more and more updating of the original learning, but our results seem to suggest that at some point, the prediction error will be large enough, things will be dissimilar enough, less likely in the Bayesian inference model, so that a new latent cause will be inferred. And as a result of that, the learning would go to the new latent cause, and there would be less and less updating of the original learning, the more likely the new latent cause is. So if you're thinking about training an animal, training yourself, training subjects, there seems to be some optimal amount of change that you can put in if you want to update old learning rather than learn something completely new. And I'm thinking of this in our daily life when we try to change a bad habit. We don't want to learn a new behavior, but that habit will come back because the habit is big and strong and has been serving us well our whole life. We want to change that habit. So you want to change it slowly and gradually, like the gradual reverse condition. And we've been thinking about this in terms of computational psychiatry, thinking about recovery from addiction, from substance abuse, gradual versus going cold turkey. Cold turkey, as you probably know, there is very high rates of relapse, and maybe that's not surprising because you don't actually change the old associations. We've been thinking about this, trying to understand treatments like prolonged exposure and CBT for post-traumatic stress disorder and how that relates to this kind of model. Okay, so that was all supposed to be one half. I'll do the other half pretty quickly. So the question is, how does this inform us about the organization of memory, or how can we use these ideas to think about the organization of memory? And here, if we're thinking about prediction errors and how they affect memory, prediction errors have been associated with dopamine signaling in the brain. And one of the targets for dopamine is the hippocampus, the seat of episodic memories. And so you might imagine that things that generate a more positive prediction error will strengthen episodic memories or will help encode episodic memories. On the other hand, there's another system. There's the locus coeruleus noradrenaline system, where that also projects to the hippocampus. And that system seems to be more active when there's more arousal or more change, regardless of whether that prediction error is negative or positive. So things, unexpected good things, but also unexpected bad things activate the noradrenergic system. And so we wanted to test how prediction errors would affect episodic memory, how reward prediction errors would affect episodic memory in this asymmetric effect or a symmetric effect. So what we did, and this is work by Nina Rouhani, who just graduated from the lab and went to Caltech to Ralph Adolph's lab as a postdoc. What she did is she gave people a reinforcement learning task where there were two different types of items that they had to learn the value of. One type of item was outdoor images and the other was indoor images. And they had to learn the value of each of these. One of them, behind the scenes, one of them was worth 40 cents on average and the other was 60 cents on average. And so they see a cue, in this case, an outdoor scene, and they're asked to estimate explicitly the value of this type of scene, to just type it in. And they see the actual value on that trial. So they got 100 cents. So we have here on each trial, the current value that they're estimating, they're telling us that. We know the reward, so we can calculate the exact reward prediction error that they experienced. And we do this trial after trial in several experiments with replications. And in fact, we also were interested in how the variance of these rewards or the risk affects memory in this case. So we had them play in one room with some background on the screen that was learning room 1 and another that was learning room 2. And in one of them, there was high risk or high variance of these rewards, and the other was low variance. Doesn't really matter for us right now. Then we had a delay of 5 to 10 minutes in which they did some other tasks. In fact, they filled questionnaires, self-report questionnaires about risk. And then we gave them a surprise memory test. And the memory test was basically asking them, showing them images and asking them whether they are old, so they previously saw them in the experiment, or new. And half of them were old, half of them were new. And in the experiment itself, each image was shown only on one trial. So each image is associated with one reward prediction error. And our results showed a symmetric effect, more like noradrenaline rather than dopamine. So things that were, images that were associated with a large negative prediction error or a large positive prediction error were better remembered later on. So that suggests an influence of noradrenaline. Also, the locus coeruleus co-releases dopamine into the hippocampus, and that's associated with plasticity. So I don't know for sure that this effect is noradrenaline. It could be dopamine, but it seems like it's not VTA. It's not the basal ganglia dopamine that we think about in reinforcement learning, because that signal would not be of this U shape. And finally, we also have here a difference between the two risk conditions. So generally, the high risk room events were remembered better than the low risk events, and that might be associated with acetylcholine. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to go to the very last set of experiments. And here, so we think that prediction errors cause this splitting of clusters that I showed you previously. There's also a lot of literature on prediction errors causing boundaries between events in memory. So our memories are kind of episodic. As time drifts, we put things together in one memory trace, and then when there's a prediction error, that causes a new memory trace to start. So all of these are aligned. But what I've shown you now is that prediction errors enhance memories directly. This was not about an event boundary. So are these two effects related? So to do that, we have to think about sequences. So you can imagine different images worth different amounts of money. And at some point, there's a large prediction error here, a large negative prediction error. So that could cause an event boundary and separate those different memory traces. Or on the other hand, what I've just shown you is a large prediction error causes a strong memory of this event. And normally when we think of memory, we think of both the event and what came before and after it. So it might actually strengthen the connection between the memory of this event and the memory of the event preceding it. So we wanted to test really mechanistically what does this large reward prediction error do to these memories? And to do that, we used the phenomenon of recognition priming. So we gave subjects an experiment just like I just showed you. They just passively watched images and saw how much they were worth. And we generated these high prediction errors because we could. We gave them the actual amounts each time. And we tested for recognition priming. So recognition priming is the effect that if I ask you whether this image is old or new, and following that I ask for this image, whether this image is old or new, priming means that when you recall this image, you immediately start to recall the next image. So your reaction time should be faster to judge the next image. So this is like, you know, when a song ends on a record, for those of you who still listened to records, like me, you immediately start playing the next song in your head. Just a memory of one event brings up the memory of the next event. So our question is, if we know that we should get recognition priming between consecutive events like these two, but what about if there was a large prediction error there? Would that cause no priming, for instance, because, sorry, that's here. No priming because of a boundary, or would we still get priming because they're very strongly associated because this is a stronger memory? And we can compare all this to pairs that are out of sequence, like this one followed by this one. They have no priming at all. And here's the result. So the out of sequence items, this is their reaction time. And you can see that items that are in sequence, whether they have a low reward prediction error or a high reward prediction error, show faster reaction times than the out of sequence items. So we do see priming. And it seems like even though that high reward prediction error event, we thought it would separate those two items, it doesn't seem to separate them. So we're kind of stuck because that's, you know, that now we don't really know if there's an event boundary or not. But one thing is we know that the memory for this high reward prediction error event is a strong memory. So maybe that's why the reaction time is fast, not because it was retrieved because of the previous item, but just it's you know, it's a very salient item. So we repeated the same experiment, but now we're looking at priming across that high reward prediction error event. So we're not using this item itself, which is maybe a special item because it has this very strong memory. We're asking, is there priming across it versus, you know, across two other, across another item that didn't generate a large prediction error. So again, you can get priming across two items. It's weaker, but you can get it. Across one item, sorry. And again, we can compare to out of sequence. And the real question is, what are we going to find across this high reward prediction error? And the answer is, now we do find evidence for a boundary. So whereas if there's a low reward prediction error event, then we still see faster recognition. So we see priming compared to out of sequence. We no longer see that for the high reward prediction error events. So and we don't need this, that's replication and another demonstration of the same thing. You can believe me, we asked it like several more times just to be sure. So summarize the big picture that comes out of all of this work, in my mind, and hopefully I've convinced you of some of this as well, is that if we think of learning as generalization, then what we know about reinforcement learning in the basal ganglia, learning from dopamine prediction error, updating values, updating policy, that kind of learning, I call it shallow learning rather than deep learning. That kind of learning is possible because we have these maybe cortical mechanisms, and I showed you only behavioral experiments, but we have experiments associating these processes with hippocampus and frontoparietal cortex and orbitofrontal cortex. This idea of representation learning, learning to represent the task, learning to decide to say all of these events are of one type, all of these are of another type, and all of these are of another type. And this is a very it's an active inference process, and it's a process that affects our memory. So our memory is a depiction of what we think are the causal structures in the world. And of course, it also affects our learning and is affected by our learning, but by how predictable things were and how they were not. And in terms of memory, how our memory is organized. So again, putting together these different experiments, my hypothesis is that memory is going to look something like this maybe. So we have a whole bunch of events that are similar to each other. So going to work, reading, thinking, doing experiments, we put them all in one cluster. And then comes something totally unpredictable, COVID-19, right? We have to work at home, we have to homeschool our kids, like everything is different. So that's going to be a very strong memory. That first day that we stayed home, I can tell you what day it was, March 11th, that we first stayed home with our kids. And then come a bunch of other memories, not that great. I mean, working at home with the kids is not fun. And all those memories are going to be clustered together with this special memory as somewhat of a bridge. So when I talked about clustering, each cluster was separate, but we can sequence things and tie our memories together. And I think that these special reward prediction error events, and I drew it here outside of this cluster. I don't know if it's in the cluster, if it's on its own, but definitely I think these are bridge events that are easy to recall and are connected to what came before and what came after. Even though the before and after are in separate clusters, that specific event is connected to both. And you know, now at least we can order in. Well, now we can't because there's the second wave. So you know, that's a structure. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer questions. I know I did not leave a lot of time for that, but I'm also happy to stay after the hour.
Great, that was fantastic. And I want to really thank you for, as usual, a very clear presentation. So, by the way, so if people have questions, please put them first in the chat box. I can then call out people to then ask questions directly. First of all, I want to say, you know, the entire time that you were talking about these, you know, basic psychological experiments, I was thinking computational psychiatry, because if you relay what you talked about to self-relevant processes, and particularly these memory boundaries, it's really striking to me that what you seem to suggest, that if you have a high reward prediction error process, that can actually separate sort of your inferences about latent causes. So if I feel like say I'm in a depression, and I feel like I'm a no good person, and I'm doing all these things because fundamentally my belief system, I'm a no good person. And then something happens, and you know, and these you know, the interesting element of it is that fundamentally, you know, many of the mood phenomena are episodic. I mean, they could be episodic long, but they are episodic. And then you may get into a different state where you say, hey, I'm not that bad of a person, you know, and the things that I'm experiencing, whether people are smiling at me or frowning at me, is actually, I'm an okay person rather than I'm a no good person. So in a sense, these transitions is what I think I'm particularly interested in. So my first question really is, I know you really carefully think about the stimuli that you're presenting to subjects because of trying to quantify this in a reasonable way. So, for example, the orientation length of a line or the number of circles and the color of the circles. How far can you drive this to make this into sort of maybe stimuli that could become relevant for an individual?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I want to start by addressing the issue of, is this relevant to mental health? And I definitely think it is, even to the point that so I spent 1 year learning and practicing CBT, and even thinking about the rate of change, and do I want the client to change their behavior very quickly, and what latent cause I want them to attribute the fact that, now dogs are not scary and before she found dogs extremely scary. Is that because I'm there? Safety signals take a different meaning because it's really a causal structure. So I do think this is very, very relevant to how we think about therapy. And we've been thinking about, in my lab, thinking about things that are not in this model yet, like taking latent causes and labeling them as internal versus external, and how that affects our inference and the likelihood and what happens when you add that to the model. And also thinking about development and how the latent causes that we infer early in life have a really strong influence on what happens later on. And if my internal cause is a very negative one because I think I'm a bad person, then all these good things that are happening to me are happening because of someone else, not because of me, etc. So that's that. These experiments are super simplified, kind of on purpose, obviously. And the specific experiments that I showed you were really aimed at asking qualitative questions, not quantitative. So I have not tried. I don't know how much we can push these stimuli. I can say that in a project now with Yunsun Shin and Sarah Dubrow, is she in this picture? She's not. They've both left the lab, but we're still continuing to work together. We have a new task where we're looking at the latent cause inference process directly. We're asking subjects to actually tell us what latent cause they are ascribing each stimulus to. And we want to see whether whether we can model that quantitatively, not qualitatively, and infer people's parameters and see whether the parameters of their inference process relate to different mental illnesses or different symptom dimensions, because we're doing this not in patients, but in an online population. So I definitely think this is very relevant, but there's a lot of research still to be done.
Yeah. Well,
I see two questions here.
So Ryan, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question directly?
Yeah, sure. No, I was just curious. I mean, because it seemed like the kind of latent cause inference stuff with the Chinese room process was kind of a separate thing from this idea of prediction error, sort of gradual versus abrupt, or large versus small magnitude prediction error updating, sort of leading to new latent cause inference or updating the original association. I guess I was just curious. Maybe I missed this, but I was wondering if you guys had actually put together kind of like a single formal model where that shows exactly how the sort of difference in prediction error magnitude would lead to the sort of probabilistic inference about which latent cause or probability of one latent cause versus another.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have two answers here. One answer is depending on the specific thing that you're modeling and its dynamics. So for instance, in the lines task where we had people guess the length and orientation of the next line, the model for that, because it's something that's changing over time, is a Kalman filter with multiple modes. So the correct Bayesian inference in that task leads to what's called a Kalman filter model, which is really a model that learns from prediction errors. So it's how you write the math in the end. I showed you the basic math, but when you plug in the specific likelihood and the specific dynamics of the environments, many times a prediction error comes back out. And the same thing when you're thinking in general about the Chinese restaurant process and basically calculating the likelihood is all about the prediction error. So it's actually, it is the same thing, even though you don't see it directly in that one equation that I showed you.
Mhm. Okay, thanks.
Robin,
do you
had a
want?
question?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking at first, because, obviously the findings with the kind of gradual extinction, versus the other kinds is perhaps highly relevant to exposure-based therapy. And so then I was thinking about how to, generalize that. And I think it would be difficult, but I'm thinking, because there's some other data, like Michelle Krask always kind of says, if you have the negative outcomes actually occur, then you can actually have better outcomes, which makes sense because you're gonna have, anyway. So I think it makes sense in the context of this, that if we, if someone actually has the negative, say if they're afraid of negative social evaluation, if they actually have a social experience where the negative outcome occurs during their exposure process, they'll probably do better and have less reinstatement later, because it kind of fits into that. But then, because you then brought up the change of habits and behaviors. And so then I was trying to bring that in, because, I feel like with exposure and avoidance behavior, which is probably a pattern habit of behavior, as well as, we do kind of, behavior does change gradually over time. And so then I was just trying to piece apart, like, do you feel like, because I feel like the specific experiment was more specific to outcomes. I know they're intertwined, behavior and outcomes, but is it the same process or different, or?
Yeah, I think these are fascinating questions, and really in my year of learning CBT, I just kept sitting there with a half smile thinking, they're just talking about reinforcement learning the whole time. It really doesn't even need translation. It's literally the same thing. And so, and I wrote a chapter about this. I didn't put it in SciArchive, or I should put it up because it's not yet out, but really translating CBT or translating what we know about reinforcement learning and about this latent cause process to some thoughts about CBT. And I think one of the really basic things in reinforcement learning, like the fundamental, is that whatever you don't explore, like actions that you don't make, you can't learn about their outcomes. So that's like, basic CBT, you have to do exposure therapy, like you have to do things, otherwise you will keep that low value forever. And it's asymmetric, because if you have, in reinforcement learning, if you have a value that's too high, then you'll choose that thing again and realize that it was too high. But if you have a value that's too low, you'll just avoid that option, and that value will stay low because there won't be new experience to change it. So low values stick and high values don't. And so there's this inherent asymmetry in reinforcement learning, and this feedback of you only can learn about what you do or what you experience, that already kind of brings up avoidance behavior and sticky avoidance behavior for long. So now, how do prediction errors come in, and the difference between what I'm saying and what Michelle Krask is talking about? So I've been thinking about, why do we do gradual, or at least what I was taught, it was gradual exposure. You start with something that's 3 on your scale of 1 to 10, and then go to 4 and 5 and 6. And so the most obvious is maybe the client won't be willing to do 8 or just won't come back. So, but putting that aside, the large prediction error could cause a new latent cause. And so Michelle Krask is talking about having as large prediction errors as possible. I think there are 2 mechanisms here. You can think about changing the old latent cause, or you can think about creating a new latent cause that's so strong and general that it will overpower the old one. These are 2 different mechanisms that can work. And the last thing is thinking about, what is really the size of the prediction error? So if I think that something will be scary, and let's say it's 8 on my scale of my fear scale, my anxiety scale, and I do that, even if nothing happened, the dog didn't bite me, still I was so scared, it was such an aversive experience, that might not actually be much of a prediction error. I thought it would be horrible, it was horrible. So I might not learn a lot from that. So I think when we're going gradually with small, the lower things on the scale, it's more likely that I thought it would be a 3 and it was a 0. It really wasn't that bad. My heart was not racing. So I had a prediction error. I think we have to think about the aversive outcomes is not only the dog is biting me, but like my internal state is an aversive outcome. If I think I'm going to have a panic attack, it's an aversive outcome. So in the end, it seemed like it would be a stronger prediction error, but it's maybe a smaller prediction error because I got exactly what I expected. So all of that is like totally hand waving, right? I haven't done a single experiment to test any of those hypotheses, but just thinking about the implications of these theories to CBT, that's my thoughts.
Thank you. It gives a lot of things to think about, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think that also the very clear and simple structure of your experiments allow you to kind of go in different directions. Because one thing I was also thinking about is that, you know, you have in all of those, you have the assumption that individuals will attribute new latent causes to the generator. But if you have something that is highly overlearned, where even the inference, you know, somebody won't go into a new inference that there might be a new cause, then maybe there's still a different process that you have to account for, namely to overcome sort of the habitual response that is not even driven by trying to do an inference process.
That's right. So there's also the Pavlovian versus instrumental components here, and how much of it is or can also think of model-based, model-free, like how much of it is deliberating, thinking about cognitive restructuring. We talked this morning about cognitive restructuring quite a lot, versus the association that's just driving your behavior automatically in a Pavlovian sense. And I think I'd originally thought that this learning the structure, learning the clusters, and learning the states is completely shared between all these systems. Like you'd have one representation of the task, and then you learn in different ways to calculate actions in this task. Some of it is automatic, and some of it is deliberate, and some of it is habitual. But now I'm not so sure, and this comes from a new postdoc in my lab, Isabel Berwian. She's gotten me thinking that if part of the inference of what is the latent cause depends on, so exactly we're talking about this morning, about inference of why did I make my action? The truth is I can't completely reconstruct this thinking right now, but it might even be that we have multiple, you can think about situations where it might be the different systems in the brain infer different structures of latent causes based on how unlikely, okay, so here is, let's say one system is saying, if I do this action, I'm likely to have this outcome, and another system saying, if I do this action, I'm likely to have this outcome. Each of them have a different prediction error. So in one of them, it's more likely to be part of that old latent cause. In another one, it's less likely to be part of that old latent cause. So very early on, you can already get divergence that different systems in our brain are not just using different algorithms to decide on action. They have a different view of the world, like alternate realities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the social phobia example is always a good example, right? Because you could say you have one model where if I approach a person, do you want to go to the movies with me? Obviously not now, but if it we can, you know, my assumption is that people think of me as a weird person and will categorically say no. And there's another model that says, you know, actually I'm sort of like an average person. It's probably a 50% chance that the person will say yes. And these models can coexist. In a sense, part of that struggle is that you know, that you're driven by these two things and you don't know which one really to throw more weight at. So that's why I think that you know, these approaches these experimental approaches can actually be quite powerful and could be used. I could even see them being used in a therapeutic setting where people then learn about themselves as how they're learning and how they're updating, right? So that, and again, the last thing I wanted to, maybe that we can finish with it, you know, in a way, if you think about it, we have interventions that are gradual, but we also have interventions that are really sudden. You know, of course, there's enormous interest now in disruptive psychopharmacology, where you put a person into a completely different state, and you're hoping that within that different state, new reorganization, learning will take place very suddenly to put the person into a different state. Like, you know, you do say something like psilocybin or some such thing. So I could clearly see that both of those things can coexist and may be subserved by different processes in the brain or different systems in the brain.
So the psilocybin example is a really interesting one because one of the things I've been thinking about and kind of a little bit bothered by is, so we had gradual extinction that worked, but gradual reverse did not. And so when you think of treatment for PTSD, it's more like gradual reverse. You slowly bring the person into like the really a place where they can really talk about the trauma. So I wonder if the psilocybin, those, you know, moving you quickly into a place where you can really go to that memory and experience it is actually doing, you experience that memory in a safe situation, is actually helping do gradual extinction rather than gradual reverse. But I don't know, I mean, this is like totally speculative. But it's interesting to me that prolonged exposure really tries to bring the person in first in like present tense, first person to I am in that experience right now. And then as you experience it again and again and again, it becomes less aversive. So it is kind of like gradual extinction once you're in that memory.
Yeah. No, again, that's the beauty of it. I can always think of a couple of experiments that one could follow up on. Well, I want to thank you again for spending the time with us. And as usual, the way you're outlining your talk, the way you're presenting your ideas is very clear and really challenging. And I really like the approach of the inferring latent causes of bad. That seems to be a useful framework for understanding exactly the questions that you're raising. Why we're looking at something sometimes similar and sometimes different, even though we're presenting with the same stimulus. So thanks again, Yael, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we will be able to have face-to-face contact again. It looks like we're on the way. So,
yes.
And again, thanks for everybody staying online. And hopefully you guys had as much as much excitement out of this hour that I did. So thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.